So if you think back to the 1800s, a man born into slavery who ultimately gets his freedom, gets thrown out into the street, becomes the first black millionaire within Atlanta. And so he's approached to acquire a life insurance company, and that is Atlanta Life. And sort of the void he saw was that the major players of the time were unwilling to provide life insurance to the people formerly enslaved. The 1905 version of GoFundMe campaigns was to hold a fish fry, charge people for the food, ultimately raise those funds, pay for a funeral and final arrangements. But that ended up having a multiplier effect. And so there's a book called Guardians of Black Economic Dignity, where it talks about sort of Alonzo Herndon, the role he played in the creation of the black middle class.
Great wealth demands great wisdom. Great power demands great care. This is Principles of Benevolence. Each episode, I sit down with founders, investors, and leaders that prove that purpose and profit aren't enemies, they're partners. So let's explore how to build companies that matter, invest with intention, and lead with benevolence at the core. My next guest grew up on the south side of Chicago, into a loving family on a block where he felt safe, but he couldn't walk in any direction without encountering the perils of disinvestment, lack of opportunity, and gun violence. He watched friends whose lives took a very different path than his own and made a decision early. The most scalable way to change things is through business. Ryan L. Smith went from Howard University to Morgan Stanley, where he worked on over $20 billion in equity offerings, to private equity at IMD Development Corporation, building large-scale minority-owned businesses, to venture capital in Silicon Valley at Bronze Investments, to becoming Director of Investments at Magic Johnson Enterprises, where he launched the venture practice and helped execute one of the most storied acquisition strategies in Black business history. Through research and diligence of acquisition opportunities to help the Black community, it led him to insurance. Today, he serves as the Executive Vice President and Board Director for Atlanta Life Insurance Company, one of the oldest and most consequential Black-owned institutions in America. Founded in 1905 by a man born into slavery who became the first Black millionaire in the South. Today, Ryan takes us inside this 120-year legacy. What he learned from Magic Johnson about investing in overlooked communities, and why life insurance might be the most underutilized wealth-building tool in the Black community. Let's welcome in Ryan L. Smith. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Happy to be here. I appreciate you having me.
So when I was doing my research on you, we have like a lot of similarities. So I'm
Hmm.
also from the Midwest. I'm from
Awesome.
Detroit.
Very nice. When you said Midwest, I knew it wasn't Chicago. So,
No, not Chicago.
indeed. Midwest love.
Yeah.
My
Uh,
grandfather's from Detroit. So,
okay, nice. And I also, as you know, went to Howard. I was a
indeed.
finance major,
Indeed.
and have been on my own journey of investing in mission-driven companies. So
Indeed.
excited to chat with you. So your career really demonstrates that you're passionate about investing in overlooked communities. Where
Hmm.
where does that passion stem from?
From growing up in one. So, by way of background, grew up on the south side of Chicago, modest home, but sort of two incredibly loving parents and four siblings. And sort of all was well within our household. But if you walked outside and you went any direction, north, south, east, west, called a couple blocks, you were immediately sort of living sort of the stereotypes of perils of what they call sort of urban or inner city communities. And what that means is sort of disinvestment, lack of opportunity, oftentimes not great schools, and sort of the results that come from that, right? If you don't sort of give people their proper resources, if you sort of make them live a life of scarcity, you get certain results. And so I ultimately became the benefactor of limited opportunities, but starting very early, as young as 8, had to experience sort of the perils of gun violence in a loved one. And as I think about sort of the trajectory of many of the people I grew up with, who were from my same neighborhood. Sort of there was a significant deviation and how our lives planned out. And so I started thinking about how do you create more opportunity within the community in which I grew up in. But then the reality is that sort of you name your inner city, you name your state, you name sort of your major urban area. What you often find is a tale of two cities. So one part of the city really prospering and another sort of disinvested and overlooked. And so that took me a number of paths. And so first was the natural thing, which is sort of being philanthropic, right? Starting a non for profit that does some good. Did that with some friends at Howard, actually, an organization called Restoring Our Character, which is the idea of those who have made it out go back and give back and sort of give the roadmap to young men and young women so they can find themselves in your seat. Felt great, grew to sort of 100 sort of students per seminar. But when I thought about actual scalable change, to me, it felt like something that felt good, but wasn't sort of necessarily scalable, at least in its current iteration. And so I started thinking about sort of what are ways that you can do this in a scalable way. And then ultimately, stumbled upon sort of the belief that the best way to do it was through free enterprise, but specifically using or creating, investing in, and building large scale minority owned businesses that cater to the underserved. And so you create opportunities, you fulfill a need, you employ from that community, you invest in that community, you love on that community. And these are often the individuals who best understand the needs of our communities. And so for that reason, that felt scalable, that felt like it could be multiplied. And so I went on sort of a lifelong sort of career pursuit to bring that to fruition.
And can you walk me through your career journey? So it sounds to me like you kinda had a arc or vision of, the types of businesses that you wanted to invest in or focus on. So did you start with, like, the end career in mind, or that you wanted to make sure that whether it be private equity or investment banking or venture, that they all
Yeah.
kinda fit under that arch?
Yeah, and that's one of those things that like is easy to tell and sort of looks really pretty in retrospect. But the reality is that sort of the dots came together over time and formed a line, right? And so first step, getting to Howard. I actually didn't go in as a finance major. We both ended up as finance majors, but I went in as a marketing major
Same.
because yeah, see, because my father had worked in marketing from a consumer perspective, and so I had some exposure to it. And then I got there, and they had the 21st Cap program, and I was put on a business team that was sponsored by Morgan Stanley. And so I spent the entire year sort of learning about Morgan Stanley, learning about Wall Street, and then just through sort of innate interest, put a lot of time and effort into it. And ultimately, we won an internship at the end of the year, and that sent me to New York after my freshman year to intern at Morgan Stanley. And that became its own journey because my brother has a best friend who had a mentee who is at Morgan Stanley who had just started full time within investment banking. He was like, "Hey, you should go meet him." But the reality is that I worked in the Brooklyn office and he worked in headquarters, so 1585 Broadway. But one day I had a training there, went and said hello. And then another thing happened. Sort of someone gets off the elevator and he says, "Hey, Carla, this is the person that I told you about, Ryan." And all she says is breakfast tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Blue Fen. And I'm like, okay, not sure she even introduced herself. And this is when he responded to me and he said, "Hey, do you know who that is?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Carla Harrison." It was the first time anyone ever told me to Google somebody. Like this is before sort of Googling someone became a verb. And
Mhm.
so looked her up and it was sort of top powerful women on Wall Street, performer, has Christmas albums, all these other things. And I was like, I guess I'll be at breakfast tomorrow morning. And so I showed up to the breakfast. And from there, just kicked off sort of this invaluable relationship. And she was like, "Hey, I had my earrings in." And she was like, "Take out your earrings. No one's going to tell you, but they'll judge you for it. And that'll impact sort of you getting an offer." And then this became sort of a trend of her educating me on how Wall Street worked. But one of the most important things that she told me and related to your question is she said that sort of we live in a capitalist society and the sort of blood or lifeblood of capitalism is finance and capital and understanding how it works. And so then it became this idea of spending time on Wall Street to understand how capital and strategy worked at the highest levels of society. And so that became a data point, right? And then it was like, all right, so I've worked on some really interesting deals throughout this experience as I joined full-time investment banking post Howard. And it was like, all right, but this is great. Some of these have made the cover of the Wall Street Journal, but it's not sort of fulfilling and it's really sort of exhausting. And so started thinking back to this idea of I ultimately want to create opportunities in inner city communities and sort of address the needs of the underserved. And so I started telling people about this idea. And so from there, they're like, hey, you need to meet this guy named Taurus. And I'm like, sure, you're like the fifth person to say it, but no one's introduced me to this guy. And someone made the introduction and he had started private equity funds specifically for this focus. So building, it was called Inner City Ventures, literally acquiring, growing large scale minority owned businesses. And he was like, why don't you join me? I'm actually starting my new entity, which is called IMB. And I'll teach you sort of what I know and you can continue on with your journey, whether it be with us or elsewhere, however you want to do it. And was incredibly priceless. And so that's when I sort of understood the private equity model, but then things had finally started to recover in Silicon Valley after the dot-com burst.
Mhm.
And I just found the companies more interesting. I was like, this is sort of where all the value is being created. This is where the most innovative ideas are happening. And so I wanted, and also from a dollar perspective, if you think about this idea of making your dollars go further, I was like, if I can get more dollars into the hands of whether it be sort of minority entrepreneurs or people who are building products or services that positively impact sort of minority communities, then that should have sort of a greater sort of multiplier effect. And how do I do this? I need to go to Silicon Valley. So my way of doing that was to go to grad school. Ultimately, was accepted into Stanford, but right before I started that, I met a gentleman named Stephen DeBerry who was creating this thing called Bronze Investments. He had wrote out a Caper Capital, and he told me that he was rolling out Bronze Investments. I'm like, hey, well, I just did this sort of fun start thing. And granted, it's different asset classes. I'm sure from an infrastructure perspective and operational perspective, it's similar. And he was like, all right, like join me on this. And then we started doing sort of double bottom line early stage venture investing, right? And so that was a lot of ed tech at the time, healthcare tech and fintech. Um, and then from there, I was like, I love all these things, but sort of how do I tie it together in sort of a larger platform? And then that's when I ultimately found my way to Magic Johnson Enterprises. And he had a 3+ decade track record of doing the things that I desired to do, at least in some form. And so that's where that journey began. And so
Oh,
again, dots that turns into lines.
okay. Well, I know working for Magic Johnson, there's usually not a job posting for those kind of
Nope.
jobs. Can you talk us through how you created that opportunity for yourself?
Yeah. So again, like this is the idea of I do best when I can align sort of my work ethic, my skill set with my passions. And so that was sort of the tourist thing. That was the Steven thing. And so I was doing the same thing here. And sort of when I was thinking about sort of doing things on a larger platform, it's like, all right, well, where is that? And there weren't sort of many options. And then I started thinking through like this is at the time, sort of 2012, they started doing, they did the Dodgers deal. And that was significant because he became the first Black owner within Major League Baseball. But prior to that, he had built out the urban investing thesis. So if we were to rewind back to the 90s, when he stopped playing, he had a belief that, hey, inner city communities are underserved and in need of sort of various products and services, but sort of major institutions, corporations, et cetera, keep discounting these communities for lower per capita income. But what you're sort of failing to think about is the other piece of this equation, which is greater density and just lack of supply, right? And so that's how he came up with the ideas of gyms, movie theater, Starbucks, etc. And that turned into institutional proof that you could then go raise institutional funds off of it. And so he did the real estate thing, the private equity thing, etc. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting, and that seems like this would be a great match. And furthermore, they've historically only done real estate and private equity. I have all those pieces plus venture capital. And I think he should sort of step into sort of the technology investing space and help to diversify this space. And so I was like, okay, this is all great in my head. But now the question becomes, so how do I get in touch with Magic Johnson? You know, it's not like I couldn't ask somebody for his phone number. And so I started mapping his organization, Magic Johnson Enterprises, And that was only so fruitful. Like I saw all the people who worked there, but there didn't seem to be any significant sort of finance or investment team. And I'm like, oh, it feels like he could use my help, but also like, who's the person doing these deals? And then I watched the speech where he shouted out his president at the time, his sort of business partner, a gentleman named Eric Holloman. And I'm like, well, this is a small world. I've invested in a similar space. What are the chances we've maybe been on an email together? And so I went into my inboxes and typed his name, and his name actually came up. But it didn't come up in the context of exchanging emails. It came up in the context of him being on the board of directors of Twigo at the time. And so I'm like, "Hey, Nancy at Twigo, can you give me an introduction to Eric?" And like, it's this idea of like, let me make this as easy as possible for him and give him no reason to say no. And so I'm like, "Hey, Stanford MBA, who's invested in all the spaces that you're interested in, who's willing to do a deal for free. And you seem to be sort of a small team, sort of one man shop. So by limitations of hours in a day, you're missing things. And so why don't you send something that you think might be interesting my way? And worst case, I just tell you a bunch of dumb stuff and you never speak to me again. And best case, perhaps we can turn this into something." And fortunately, he agreed. So I did diligence on this one transaction that I ultimately recommend we not do. But the funny thing is that we were doing diligence. I flew to LA, sitting in Eric's office with the entrepreneur, and a knock comes on the door, and it's Magic. It's Irvin Magic Johnson. He walks in, says hello, and sits down, and just says continue. And so I'm like, all right, now just continue the meeting. And then he leaves after about 30 minutes, but not expressing sort of any sentiment on how he thinks he's going. But then we connect afterwards and he was really complimentary and that it started to build the trust with the organization. And so while we didn't do that deal, I would literally every Wednesday send an email like, "Hey, do you need help with something?" And the next deal that came up was the Los Angeles Sparks. And so flew to LA. We knocked that deal out in 9 days. And from there, sort of trust was really built. And so both Irvin and Eric were like, "Hey, we want you to come do this full time." And so I started literally flying back between Palo Alto and LA. And then when I graduated, I moved to LA and did a dual role, sort of doing venture investing. So launched the venture practice. So did what I thought he should be doing, sort of getting him into sort of the tech investing space with a particular emphasis on minority entrepreneurs, those catering to the minority community and doing a private equity thing. And that's also sort of what ultimately led to this insurance journey. Because the deal that came up after the Sparks was the acquisition of EquiTrust, which is our first life insurance acquisition.
Wow.
And my view was like, shoot your shot, right? In worst case, if like nothing happens and it's crickets, like you try and maybe it's not now, perhaps it may not be not never,
Yeah.
but I still got time in my semester before graduation. I can go hunt for other jobs and things of that sort. And it worked out. It was divine timing on both sides.
It's interesting because I saw like maybe a 30-second clip of you talking about this Magic Johnson story on my LinkedIn feed. In retrospect, I wish I would have went and watched the entire episode because basically in the 30-second clip, you talk about how you
No,
gave me the
it was
courage to
destined for me
shoot
to
my
tell you
shot.
today. So yeah.
And there's a billionaire family office that
Hmm.
I found out that, oh, I know someone that can so I,
Uh-huh.
like, created a deck for this
Uh-huh.
is, like, back in the fall. Created
Yeah.
a deck because the billionaire had talked about how they want to get in mission-driven investments. So I'm like,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, I should lead this
Yep,
for
that's
them."
me. Yep.
But now that I listen to you, like, I pitched myself like, I pitched a role, like, "You need to
Uh-huh.
bring me on as director of investments." I made a pitch deck, I made a portfolio for them.
Uh-huh.
And I have not heard back from them, but that's okay. I keep hope alive. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
say the name of the billionaire because, as you probably know, a lot of these
Yeah.
billionaire family
It's
offices
just
are
yep.
very stealth. They don't want
Indeed.
you to find them. So if they ever do
Indeed.
call me back, I don't
Indeed.
want y'all to know who I'm working for.
I think that call is coming. But yeah, I mean, that was my whole view. It was like, what are all the objections that could lead to me not getting a yes, right? And so it was unknown commodity. Yes, I have some branding in terms of the places I've been, in terms of the university I'm currently at. But again, you have nothing to lose. Just send me the
Yeah. I
materials.
wish I would have
Yeah,
said, "I will help you for free." That's what I
yeah,
should have said.
yeah.
But
And
it's
s-
okay.
and then from there, it worked out eventually. So this is again a pretty picture in retrospect, but it's led to an incredible journey.
And how did insurance come up? I assume that's probably some businesses that you were looking into for
Yeah.
Magic Johnson, but what
So it
led
was
you
part
there?
of yeah, so from MJ perspective, again, historically have been very sort of private equity focused. So acquisitions, whether they be sort of outright acquisitions or control acquisitions. And so the opportunity came up to acquire a life insurance, but really an annuity provider. And so I viewed it in the same way that I had viewed private equity, right? Like we didn't have a sector focus. And so oftentimes it was this idea of like needing to get up to speed on a particular sector, a particular type of business, and then break it down from a fundamental perspective and a quantitative or technical perspective. And that's how I approached it. And so started breaking down sort of this company and saw that it was incredible for a number of reasons. One, from a business model perspective, two, from a social good perspective, because a lot has been said about sort of the retirement crisis that currently exists and is likely to only sort of get exacerbated. And annuities are sort of lifetime income or insurance against longevity. And so that began what was a year-long process to acquire EquiTrust, which at the time was $14 billion in assets and now is approaching $40 billion in assets. And so this is 11 years later. And then that journey led us down sort of an insurance rabbit hole. So you start to learn about the business, you operate this carrier, and then you realize there's sort of repeatable principles that sort of may make sense for you to like have a corporate development strategy and grow both organically and inorganically. And so that's sort of how things evolved. And that ultimately leads to like the story with Atlanta Life and things of that sort, and thinking about product diversification, thinking about catering to a different customer with life insurance. It's often a younger person versus a retiree. And also it led me to the discovery of another incredible story that I didn't know about, which was the story of Alonzo Herndon and Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which is the mural right behind me and the desk I'm sitting in right now.
Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, of course. It is I call it the ultimate triumph of the underdog story. So if you think back to the 1800s, a man born into slavery who ultimately gets his freedom through sort of the Emancipation Proclamation, but literally basically gets thrown out into the street and has to fend for yourself, have to figure out life. And so initially he did that through sort of peddling and sort of just making ends meet. But then he used those funds to pick up a trade, which was barbering, ultimately built that into quite the clientele and quite the business to whereby he created three barbershops within Atlanta. But the crazy thing is that given sort of the climate of the time and the laws of the time, he couldn't even walk through the front door of his own barbershop. But it allowed him to have three thriving businesses. He would then take those proceeds and he would buy up real estate. He ultimately went on to own 100 properties, but specifically what he was doing was providing affordable housing to the other folks who had been emancipated and didn't have access to sort of quality, affordable housing. And then through that, continues to build an empire, becomes the first Black millionaire within Atlanta. And then that gives him a prominence within the business community in Atlanta. And so he's approached to acquire a life insurance company, and that is Atlanta Life. And sort of the void he saw was that the major players of the time were unwilling to provide life insurance to the Black community or sort of people formerly enslaved because of the impacts that slavery had on them and what that could mean for sort of like lifespan and mortality. And so he would see families when it's time to sort of navigate that difficult moment and bury their loved one and give them that sort of last moment of dignity and honor and then go on thereafter. The only way they could accomplish that is through a Friday fish fry. And so on Fridays, the 1905 version of this, 1805 version of GoFundMe campaigns was to hold a fish fry, charge people for the food, ultimately raise those funds, pay for a funeral and final arrangements, and then sort of hopefully have something left to sort of carry on despite the loss of your loved one and also the income they brought. But that ended up having a multiplier effect again, because now he's getting people life insurance, but also what he's doing, the way he would sell it is through agents. And so you're also employing people from the community. And so there's a book called Guardians of Black Economic Dignity, where it talks about sort of Alonzo Herndon, the role he played in the creation of the Black middle class. And so there's this incredible story about seeing an opportunity, catering to your community, employing your community, and all the language he used about stakeholder capitalism, inclusive capitalism, things of that sort, and multiple stakeholders. He was living that before that language even existed. And then he successfully transitioned the business to his son Norris, who goes on, like he gets educated at the AUC, goes on to HBS, comes and runs the company for decades, and is a key silent funder of many of the things happening during the civil rights movement. And then you fast forward to the first non-family CEO, Jesse Hill, and the incredible role he played from being Andrew Young's campaign manager when he ran for Congress to playing a pivotal role in terms of being finance chair for the election of Maynard Jackson when he became the first black mayor. And so you just see like this 120-year history. And again, like this idea of like building large scale minority owned businesses, like you also have to preserve them. And there are not many companies, minority owned or not, that have 120 plus year legacies. And so when I discovered this story in 2018, it actually felt too good to be true. Like you look at pictures of the Niagara movement and you see Alonzo and Norris sitting there in the picture. You look at sort of pictures of parades in Atlanta in the early nights, and there's Alonzo and Booker T. Washington riding in the back of a Model T. Like it's just all this crazy stuff. And so it was a legacy that needed to be continued in the next 100 years that needed to be chartered. And again, to the point of learning insurance, having capital, having expertise, having relationships, it was sort of the perfect suite or toolkit to chart the next 100 years for this company, but sort of honoring the Herndon legacy of serving the underserved, which like today is there are 102 million American adults who need either life insurance holistically or more life insurance. And the impact that can have on sort of wealth planning, sort of making life easier after people experience their worst moments is sort of the journey we're on now, is closing that life insurance need gap.
Wow. I love Black history. I also hate that, like, I did not know this story, and I'm
Yeah, I
sure
thought it was
there's so
crazy. We
many
went to
other
Howard,
stories. Yeah, like, I've never heard of him.
I'm like, how is this story not told more, which is a disservice and something we're trying to address now as well. So
As if that story wasn't inspiring enough, I'm curious, is the story what inspired you to kinda come to the other side of the table and wanna become an operator versus just an investor? Or
uh, so it was a coalescence, right? So have moved into sort of that dual role at EquiTrust, from the perspective of having operating responsibility, but also looking to sort of lead corporate development and innovation. And then here, this just felt like the true coalescence of everything I had talked about in terms of large scale minority owned business, 120-year track record, sort of living the way or sort of operating the way I imagine a company should. And then a discovery I had with EquiTrust was this idea of insurance as a social good if deployed properly, right? So annuities, retirement income, life insurance, even more so from a couple of different facets, one of which is tax-free transfer of funds to your loved ones in the event of your death so they can carry on. Another way to think about that is a creation of an estate in a single day. But then there are more fun stories where you don't have to talk about mortality per se, right? And so I presume we've all heard of Disney, we've all heard of McDonald's, my alma mater, Stanford. The commonality of those three things is that in the early days, they were funded by life insurance. So borrowing against policies, selling policies, etc. And so you think about both of those companies now, and they what have $200 billion of equity value each. And so it's also sort of this, it can be this Swiss Army knife that helps you navigate life, right? From paying for education to funding a business to funding a down payment for a home to sort of whatever sort of desire you have, right? To potentially sort of use proceeds to make a investment with higher returns, right? And so it was democratizing access to the tools that the wealthy have historically used. And like another example is the Rockefeller family, right? Like if you were to go Google, if you were to go ask Claude, it will about their sort of use of life insurance. It will literally tell you how they've used it to preserve their dynastic wealth across sort of generations. And so it's sort of providing that information, providing this tool, providing it in an affordable way that materially impacts lives in a positive way.
And Atlanta Life kind of continues on the legacy of your founder. It seems like there's a lot of community
Mhm.
initiatives that you guys do beyond just life insurance. Can you talk us through some of that?
Yeah, we don't do marketing. We like literally give back to the community. Like it's this idea of like this is another thing I enjoyed about sort of life insurance to the point of like you asked me about going into an operator role. It's that the company does best and our policyholder does best when the policyholder lives as long as possible and has the highest quality of life for as long as possible. And so with that being true, I should be investing and whatever I can to make that true for you, right? And so if you think about that, we think about this from a wellness tripod perspective. And so naturally there's the natural tie to financial wellness, right? And all the ways I just talked about. But then there's physical wellness. So we want to encourage people to be active, to exercise, to sort of maintain good, healthy habits that help increase the probability of longevity and lifespan, and then also from a mental health perspective, which many of society were exposed to, or sort of from a knowledge perspective, awareness perspective, during the pandemic and isolation, right? And sort of getting people access to the tools that help them navigate sort of any issues or concerns they may be having. And so we try and do that as much as we can. And so we do a lot of sort of activations in Atlanta. We do a lot of activations across the nation, call it Chicago, DC, Los Angeles, name your place, and do a lot of sort of interesting partnerships with organizations and entities that have the same view. Like one that's really popular that we do is Strengthen the City, and they have a belief that everyone has a right to wellness, and we believe that. And so we partnered to sort of champion that message and champion healthy habits and champion people have the things they need to sort of have their best life to the extent we can.
And you talked about from the founding story, that he used to host fish fries so that people
Mhm,
could raise money to bury the dead, and now
mhm,
we do GoFundMe's.
mhm.
I feel like our community, the Black community, is like sleeping on life insurance.
Absolutely.
Have you guys? I don't know if you've done any research on this, but over time, do you feel like the awareness of life insurance or investing in ways that we can not 100 years from now be still
Mhm.
having the same conversation?
Yeah, I mean, sort of the idea that we have sort of the technology version of the fish fry in the form of GoFundMe today is a disservice, right? And also, if you think about sort of the power of compounding effects, right? And you think about the preceding generations, if there had been a tax-free transfer of some six-figure sum, seven-figure sum over the course of those decades and it compounds, imagine what that looks like now. Imagine how much smaller the wealth gap may be, right? And so, yes, our community has slept on life insurance from two perspectives, but there's also an interesting industry dynamic. And so, if you think about sort of Magic's view about sort of inner cities, right, and this idea of being discounted for lower per capita income, like that idea and that perception and belief have sort of seeped its way into life insurance as well, right? And this idea of if you have lower per capita income, you can afford less premium. And so I should probably sell you a smaller policy. And so what you would see in the statistics is that the Black community actually over indexes to having life insurance. But the issue is the size of those policies and sort of them being small face value policies like final expense and final range or final expense and things of that sort. And so that sort of defeats sort of the wealth transfer that something is better than nothing, right? And then there's this idea of like, I have life insurance through my job. Like the likely reality of that is that it's probably not portable. So if you leave that job, it doesn't go with you. And also it is far less than you actually need. Like it's oftentimes sort of call it one time to two times sort of your salary. And if you think about sort of your lifetime earning potential, if you think about sort of how much face value you would need, it's drastically more than that. And so that's why I encourage people to have individual policies. And then most people don't know about it as a tool that has sort of living benefits, right? This idea of like one way people think about life insurance is the most selfless gift, right? Because it's the sort of death benefit occurs when you're ultimately no longer here. And so it's when they say the idea sort of plant the seeds of trees that you'll never see the shade from or something like that. I butchered that, but directionally that's right. But again, like the earlier you get it, the better. Like my daughter has life insurance. My daughter is 3, and it is cash value accumulation. And it will be an asset to her as she grows older and she has the option of what she wants to do with that at the appropriate time, right? But also, it's been slept on life insurance from a occupational perspective. And so I think the insurance industry gets a bad rap. Part of that is through people only encountering it when they have a negative experience, a claim, and then sometimes getting pushback or difficulty from insurance carriers. But another one is like it's a Woody Allen quote that's like something to the effect of like, I know there's a hell I spent the hour with a life insurance agent. And sort of what people don't realize is how big this industry is. It's literally multi trillions of dollars, and within that, there's a significant earning opportunity in the form of selling it through commissions. You get revenue. And so I talked about the 102 million American adults who need more life insurance. Conservatively, that represents $25 billion of annual premium or revenue that a life insurance agent can tap into that pool and build a really, really nice life for themselves. And you don't even have to do this full time. Like I talk
Oh,
to trainers about this. I talk to people who are doing a number of sort of gig-based things, and
mhm.
I'm like, "Get licensed, learn about this, and have it as another sort of revenue stream in your life." And the beauty of it is that you get to make money while doing a social good, getting people a product that they need.
Speaking of like wealth creation and wealth
Mhm,
building, and I feel like right now what's happening with like the wealth transfer and
mhm,
a number of businesses, small
mhm,
businesses transferring ownership because the
mhm,
baby boomers retiring. I know that when you were doing with Magic Johnson, it was on a much larger scale.
mhm,
But for someone thinking about going into ownership through
mhm.
acquisition, how should they be evaluating businesses and what should they be looking for a solid business to think about
So I'm a big
acquiring?
fan of sort of the ETA movement, right? This entrepreneurship through acquisition. But people should acknowledge that it is challenging, right? On two fronts. One of which is having slash raising the capital to do it, and then also having the requisite sort of expertise to evaluate the opportunity and then operate it successfully thereafter. And so you should sort of step back and say, hey, sort of what are my skill sets? What do I know sort of uniquely? And that might be two answers. That might be sort of finance and investment, or that might be the specific sort of focus area of said business. And then from there, you should have a view on what a successful business looks like in that particular area and sort of establish that criteria, right? Like looking at sort of the customer set, looking at the financials, looking at the operations, looking at the infrastructure, and evaluating all those things. One, to assess is it a good business? Is there untapped sort of possibility and opportunity? And also to think about sort of broader sort of societal or macro trends, like, what does that mean for said business, right? And so if you think about the positive or affirmative case in this AI sort of proliferation world, everyone is talking about the trades, right? So plumbing, electricity, etc. Like those are things that maybe one day get displaced by robots, but unlikely. And there is an expertise needed and a value that there is to it, right? But if you think about sort of rote, sort of monotonous tasks or like really sort of administration heavy things that AI can do very quickly and very easily and even better, like then you might run into a problem, right? Like this is having significant ramifications across all industries. It's impacting sort of the value a lawyer can give to you, right? It's impacting the value accountants can give to you. It's impacting certain entry level jobs within every single sector, right? And so it's understanding how all these things play together to determine if it is a good business. And then if you're doing entrepreneurship through acquisition, you're probably leveraging some element of like debt. And so does your business support the requisite cash flows to be able to service that debt and not cause you sort of any personal debt? And then from there, as the debt is paid down, that creates equity value, which ends up being sort of the wealth creation sort of event.
All right, that was helpful. That went a lot deeper than I feel like
Eh,
just the
My
hype of
bad.
what I see
My
around it.
bad.
No,
I double
that's
clicked too
great.
much. Yeah.
No, I think that's actually great, like, walking
Yeah.
through the mechanics because I feel like it can look shiny,
Yeah.
like, "Oh, this business has 2,000,000 in
Yeah.
revenue a year, like, let me
Yeah.
just get it," but there's
Yeah.
so many
And also what
dynamics
I point
that
a lot of
yeah,
people to is recent retirees, right? Like people are living
yeah,
longer. Some people are retiring younger, but a lot of people have to work far longer than they anticipated. But it also presents this idea of a second career, right? So you
mhm.
had a multi-decade career doing something, you develop a certain skill set. Is there an entrepreneurial opportunity related to that? And you get to focus on that. It is yours, and it can create sort of another or your first sort of wealth creation event, and also give your family an asset.
Yeah, I have a few friends that have recently bought businesses, be it
Mhm.
franchise or others.
Yeah,
Their parents are working there,
yeah,
so you can keep it in the family.
yeah. Which could be a pro or con, but yes.
Yeah.
So,
So as you know, there's been a lot of disruption in the
hmm
labor market,
hmm
and a lot of people are trying to figure out like, how do I build something for myself? A lot of Black
hmm
women have been laid off, and the
hmm
rise in
hmm
minority business ownership, I think it's rising. But as we know, a number of minority only owned businesses are sole proprietorships.
hmm
What is blocking them from scaling? And I know that's kind of mass generalization, but what are some trends that you've seen?
I will tell you the things commonly cited, right? And so, big one, access to capital. And
Yeah.
so, this idea of it takes investment and capital to grow. And there's a number of considerations there, one of which is like the wealth disparity, right? So, if there is a call it 6 to 1 sort of difference in the median net worth for sort of black and white households, right? That means that as a black person, and trying to raise your friends and family around, it is probably going to be significantly more difficult because the people who you likely know just don't have sort of the liquid, sort of discretionary assets to be able to cut you a check for the amounts you need, right? So that's one consideration. And then that becomes a stifler to grow because you can't sort of then hit sort of your next milestone that then probably allows you to unlock sort of institutional capital. And that's when you start to really grow and scale, right? So that's one consideration. To your idea of like the sole proprietorship, like there's the stat, it's either 96 or 97% Black owned businesses are sole proprietorships, right? And so if I think about that from an investment perspective, then that means my investment is solely dependent upon you. And so if something happens to you, this business now dies. And so that is what's considered sort of a fatal risk, right? And so that is likely to discourage many people from investing, and then people get into this idea of sort of institutional knowledge, sort of the reps of having built businesses and sort of this professional talent thing. But again, that is a limitation because, like, if your business only has this finite amount of revenue or profit, then your ability to go out and hire and get the best talent is limited by the sheer limitations of the dollars you have, right? And so this is just like this negative sort of self perpetuating cycle. And it is getting worse in today's climate, right? Because a lot of minority entrepreneurial ventures are related to public sector funding, right? And that could be in the form of government contracts, rather federal, state, local, et cetera. Like you think about Atlanta, and you think about sort of the building slash expansion of Hartsfield Jackson the airport, like it created a incredible amount of sort of black millionaires, right? And if you think about sort of this city and sort of its supplier diversity spending, I think Mayor Dickens said it's like around like 40% goes to minority owned businesses, right? Like those are wealth multipliers beyond sort of this idea of like losing your job and losing your salary. Like these are things that take sort of generational wealth away. And then if we think about growing pie is better for all, right? Like there's a McKinsey study that came out, I think last year, maybe the year before, and it talks about if we were to close the wealth gap, it would add 4 to 6% to global GDP, or I should say US GDP, And if you put that into dollars, that's $1 to $2 trillion. And then there's like some statistic whereby it's like if you increase GDP growth, for every 1% you increase GDP growth, you improve the lives of all the citizens by like $15,000. So then you sort of put a 4x multiplier on that and imagine like everybody's living in a place of like abundance and semi prosperity, and what that means for tax dollars, what that means for our educational system, what that means for business growth, all these sort of positive impacts. And all the data is there from an independent company performance perspective with regard to the importance, or I should say, the value amplifier that is sort of having a diverse and inclusive workforce and sort of what that does in terms of putting you into the top quartile of company performance. And so, like, it's absurd to reject these notions and not want a bigger pie and for everyone to do better. And so I believe in this idea of everyone doing better and we all do good. And so I'm trying to sort of bring that to fruition in my efforts.
Yeah, I actually interviewed Shelley Stewart
Mm,
yesterday from McKinsey to talk through some of this
awesome.
stuff.
Yeah, he is the author behind a number of these important studies. The Center for Economic Mobility. I read them every time they come out.
Yes, very
Which
important
they
work.
gave an incredible they gave an stat last year in their report, and it talks about sort of the wealth gap. And if you were to hold steady sort of white median wealth right now, it would take black folks just from today to get to that number 300 years, which is unfortunate. And again, a growing pie is better for all.
Yeah, hopefully with more studies like this, I mean, the evidence is all there.
No, the evidence is there, right? You either choose to believe it or you don't, right?
Exactly. I feel like
Yeah,
they're gaslighting us.
yeah.
They know.
Yeah, you either want inclusive economics or you don't. But if you don't, it's a detriment to everyone.
And you've spent your entire career proving that building wealth and improving the well being of others is not in conflict. What keeps you going, and what does winning actually look like?
Yeah, so what keeps me going is that it is a massive and like seemingly insurmountable issue, right? And so it's this idea of it's one thing to say solve it, it's another to just say put as big of a dent in it as I can, right? And so and also like every business created, every person employed, every investment made is its own unique case of progress, and then they sort of aggregate to something meaningful over time to sort of what I hope to be sort of my life mosaic. And so that's what keeps me going. Like if I employ one person, like their family is now in a better situation. If I, to your point about the sort of wealth transfer and sort of the transfer of number of businesses, if there's been a person who's built a company for 50, 60 years, and I get to provide them that liquidity event and that go then funds sort of their charitable or philanthropic endeavors. Like that's also a multiplier effect virality. And so I'm just trying to have sort of the greatest positive impact that I can have. And do I think it'll ever be solved? Probably not, because it's not static, it's fluid, but significant progress can be made. And that is my hope, is to sort of be an accelerator of said progress.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. I mean, the reason that I started this podcast is I want to give people examples of ways that they can build wealth while also helping people.
Right?
And as someone with a venture background, I was like, I don't want just a ton of VCs. Like, I want to
Yeah.
show there's so many ways to go about this. So, thank you for teaching us all about life insurance and different
One,
ways that
thank you
we
for
can pursue
creating
this.
this. And also thank you for having me. This is this is really cool, really awesome. So kudos to you,
Thank you.
of course.
Thanks for listening to Principles of Benevolence. If you like the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple or your favorite platform to listen to podcasts. And as an act of benevolence, share with an ambitious friend who wants to build a life with purpose in mind. You can find me at Principles of Benevolence on IG, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and principlesofbenevolence.com. Until next time.